With that, I'm going to introduce our speaker. So Ross Fraser works for Cade Insurance, and he has been with Cade since 2012 and specializes in working with not-for-profit organizations. Ross has been working with our group insurance program for several years as well, so he has lots of inside knowledge on it, and he's going to share some of that with you tonight. And again, if you have questions for Ross, please put those in the Q&A, and I'll direct those to Ross at the end. So thank you very much for joining us, Ross, and I'll let you take it away.
Thanks, Leslie. I appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for dialing in tonight. I'm flattered and only a little nervous to have so many of you joining us tonight. So I hope we can make this useful for you. I think before we dive in too deep, I'll just I won't speak too much. Leslie did a great introduction, but very briefly, my name's Ross. I work for Cade Associates. Cade Associates is the insurance broker. We're an independent insurance broker, and we work with Ontario Nature to administer their insurance program. And I was tracking the chat for a little bit there to see who was here, and some of you I know, and hello to you. And for those of you who aren't a part of the insurance program, I hope you find this to be useful. If there's more you'd like to learn about it, please do let me know. My contact information is part of the presentation, widely available either on the website. Leslie can share it with you. It's also at the end, so don't feel like you have to scramble and write it down now. But one thing I did want to flag, though, just for those of you who are members of the Nature Network but might not be part of the insurance program, is just that tonight I'll be speaking specifically about the insurance program that is run through Ontario Nature. So if there are any particular little coverage tweaks or whatever that may not apply to your organization, it's important to just keep that in mind. So I thought I would just really quickly give a bit of an overview on a few points. So we'll talk about the insurance program in general, some of the main coverages that are part of the program, things to think about. Then we'll talk a little bit about what organizations are up to, or more importantly, maybe some of the considerations for excluded activities, things that we should talk about there. It's not a long list. And then move into an overview of some best practices, things that almost like an FAQ, some questions we get about stuff that comes up a lot for clubs and organizations. And then we can take some time for questions at the end. Similar to how I was speaking to those who might not be participating in our insurance program at the moment, broadly speaking, please treat this as sort of a general overview of insurance in general and of the insurance program. If you have any specific questions about your organization, your operations, how your insurance policy responds, the coverages in place, that sort of thing, give me a shout independently, or make sure you speak with your insurance provider if you're insured elsewhere, because obviously we should be speaking specifically when we're talking about our own organizations and insurances. So as Leslie mentioned, we are very proud to attend to the Ontario Nature Insurance Program. I've been doing this now for 12 years in May. And it's a real pleasure, honestly, it is to get to handle and interact with the wide variety of groups that make up the Ontario Nature Network, and the great work that you do. I look at insurance, I should say, as a way to allow organizations that are volunteer driven to keep doing the good work that they're doing. The focus of your organization is, and correctly should be, on doing the good work that you're trying to do, whatever that may be for your community, for your environment. The need to worry about protecting yourselves is real, and it's an important part of being, a director or executive member or volunteer of an organization, regardless of how formal or informal it may be. But the point of the Ontario Nature Insurance Program itself is to sort of have a product that attends to the needs of the average organization, if that makes sense. And there will always be some operations or groups that are just outside of the spectrum of kind of the quote unquote average. But the idea is to try and come up with something that attends to the needs of the many, to allow you to sort of go do the work that you do. And we do that primarily through the first kind of foundational coverage in the policy called general liability insurance. And many of you will be familiar with this, especially if you've been on the phone with me before. General liability insurance is the portion of the policy that responds to a claim alleging that the insured's negligence in the operations that you do, in the work that you do, resulted in bodily injury or property damage to a third party. So effectively, somebody gets hurt or their stuff gets damaged, and they sue alleging that it was your negligence that contributed to that injury or that damage. Within the Nature Network program, the organization itself is our named insured. It's what shows up at the top of the policy. But built into the wordings, the policy considers to be an insured also your volunteer workers, as well as your members if they are sued because of the actions of your organization. And a volunteer worker, the definition is quite broad. Basically, it is a person who is volunteering at the direction of the organization to do your work, basically, and isn't receiving any compensation. You can reimburse them for out-of-pocket expenses, obviously, but they aren't taking any compensation for the work that they're doing, and they're operating within the scope of kind of their assigned duties. When I say that the policy will respond, liability insurance responds to litigation. So you get sued. So you get a statement of claim, shows up in the mail or somebody drops it off, and you hand that over to us. The statement of claim is going to say that you did a whole bunch of terrible things. The benefit of the liability insurance policy is that your insurer receives the statement of claim and becomes your lawyer. So it is their job to receive the statement of claim, review the statement of claim. They'll talk to you about what that means, and it's a whole process we can review and discuss in more detail if you'd like. But their job then is to investigate those allegations against you and to mount the legal defense on your behalf, to fight the good fight. If you are found still to be legally liable for whatever the incident was, then the policy will pay the compensatory damages that get awarded through the process up to your limit of insurance, which in the Nature Network program is $5 million. So I've spoken at length about general liability because it's kind of the most applicable liability coverage to most organizations. That's the thing that we're most worried about more often than not, is somebody getting hurt or something getting damaged and somebody suing the organization. Everybody in the Nature Network insurance program has general liability insurance. I want to say the number I just ran at 80-ish, 79%, I think, of the organizations that participate also then opt to buy directors and officers liability insurance. And this is a different type of insurance, not because of who it covers. I mentioned before, the general liability protects your volunteer workers. That includes your directors, your executive members, your officers. What this other type of insurance, directors and officers liability insurance, does is respond to different types of claims, a different allegation. So rather than physical injury, which we've talked about on the general liability side, this policy responds to an allegation that a wrongful act in the governance of the organization resulted in a financial loss to a third party. So not a physical injury, not a physical loss, but a financial one. So an example might be your membership collectively suing the board for financial mismanagement of the organization. Or an organization might make a decision to maybe it's one of the 20 or 30% that own land or have some control over a property. If you make a decision on that property that the neighbor thinks that their property value has been diminished, they might sue you for that financial loss. So directors and officers insurance is the type of policy that responds in that case. And for a lot of organizations, the work that you're doing, the exposure to a successful directors and officers liability claim, one where you are in fact found to be liable for the wrongful act, is lower. I mean, you're not at most of the organizations, I should say, aren't out there managing tremendous funds of money. You're not engaged in a lot of activities that might have a consequence in that space. But the value of the policy, and it's quite cost effective, is that it allows the policy to respond to an allegation in the statement of claim. So before I said you might get that scary statement of claim in the mail that says you did these horrible things. If 5 of them are all directly related to the general liability insurance, but then the 6th one just happens they slid one in that was that needs the directors and officers insurance to respond, with this coverage in place, the insurer can continue to protect you on that sixth thing, even if it's absolute total garbage that it even got put in there, and sometimes it is. The power of liability insurance to me is in the defense. It's that you are able to have the insurer in your back pocket to respond to these things with their professional and capable claims and legal teams. One of the other, I'm gonna jump back to the conversation for a second and talk about property insurance. This comes up a little bit less, well, actually quite a bit less frequently. Property insurance is about insuring physical assets against loss or damage. So it's not about insuring like a space that you own, like a land or a conservation easement agreement or managed property or something. It's literally about insuring a physical asset against physical loss or damage. So if you own a building, or if you own equipment, or you lease office space and you want to insure your furniture and computers and stuff, if you have field equipment, these sorts of things where we're talking about insurance against physical loss or damage is available for purchase. It is relevant to some, not to all. And of course, if you think it's relevant to you, let me know. Accident compensation is an entirely different form of coverage, and I'm going to speak about it briefly just because it's important to know, and we have this as an available option. So we mentioned before how under the liability insurance, your volunteers aren't insured. And so if a volunteer is out doing something, maybe they are helping to maintain a trail, and while they're out there, they cause injury to another person. If that person turns around and sues them, they were out there doing the work of the association or the organization, the policy will respond to protect them if they're sued for those operations. If the volunteer themselves is injured in the process, that volunteer could turn around and sue the organization, alleging that maybe you failed to provide them with sufficient safety training or safety equipment, or you put them in a knowingly unsafe environment. Whatever the allegation might be, they're suing you, alleging that your negligence hurt them, caused you the injury. And your general liability insurance would respond to protect the organization, to defend against those allegations. And if they found that you were legally liable, then yes, there would be a payment to the injured party based on the damages awarded in the case. That could take years. Litigation is lengthy and complicated, and in a lot of cases, the lawsuit doesn't start for quite some time, a year and a half, after the actual injury. Accident compensation coverage, very different. It insures your insured person, which in this case could be volunteer workers or employees, depending on your setup. And it is a way of providing a one-time lump sum benefit that pays out up to $25,000 for serious and permanent injury. So we're not talking about, a sprained ankle or a broken wrist or something that prevents you from working, which is problematic and hard for the volunteer, of course, but not the focus of accident compensation coverage. Accident compensation coverage is a very serious injury that leaves somebody, for example, permanently unable to use a limb or a digit or an eye or an ear. And based on a schedule of benefits, will pay them some compensatory immediate dollars. Like I said, the maximum is $25,000. This is not life-changing funds we're talking about here, but it puts some money in their pocket right away to cover some immediate expenses. There are some other coverage enhancements that are part of that package that pay a little bit more for, if they need assistive technologies installed in the home because of this new injury, these sorts of things. So something that right away gives the volunteer some immediate recovery. Again, not necessarily enough for the rest of their life or anything, but something that is available to them quickly. And that coverage is broadly available. We have a program set up for this that is, I can tell you exactly how much it costs to add that coverage. So the minimum premium is $50, and then the cost is based on the estimated average number of individual volunteers you have over the course of the year. So you've got 10 board members and 5, 10 other people that come to help out over the course of the year. So the number of different people that show up on average, it's $3.50 per person. That's basically the pricing on that. If you have employees, that it's $10 per employee to add that coverage. So something worth thinking about, not for everybody, certainly. And but if it's something that your executive would value in providing the volunteers, let me know. We can obviously take a look at that in more detail. I wanted to speak on cyber insurance because it's a well, it's one of those topics that just keeps coming up. And it is also the insurer has launched a new kind of I'll say relaunched their cyber insurance product with a couple of changes. Really briefly, I will say cyber insurance. So the general liability and directors and officers, the liability coverages we've been talking about don't pertain to online operations. So websites and Facebook and Twitters or X, I guess, and data that you store online on a computer in the cloud. These are not purview of the insurance that we've talked about so far. And cyber insurance has become increasingly relevant for organizations of all sizes, especially not necessarily because of the pandemic, but certainly influenced by it or maybe enhanced by it. Where the cyber insurance marketplace in Canada had seen, I think it's come down a little bit, but certainly in 2022, I think it was, the numbers were showing that, for every dollar the insurers were taking in premium on cyber related coverages, they were paying out $4 in claims costs. Now, that is largely due to, well, there's lots of different reasons, and I won't go into it in a ton of detail here, but what I would like for you to take away from the cyber insurance conversation is two things. One, the insurer through the Nature Network program has the ability to provide some cyber insurance coverage at, I'll say, low limits of insurance and a low cost of entry, meaning both from a premium value and also because there are no applications at these low limits. But even if you decide that this is not for you, I encourage you to treat the concept of cyber insurance or the discussion of cyber insurance as an opportunity for the organization to sort of think internally, okay, what are we doing online? Where is our data? Is it backed up? Who's got access? How do we protect it? What would happen if it was gone? How are we managing our online content? So I'm going to quickly go through these available coverages here and speak to them. And even if you are sitting there thinking, we're never going to buy cyber insurance, that's fine and understandable. But just keep that framework in mind as to how these might apply to you from a risk management point of view, at least. So these are the various pieces of the cyber insurance coverage available through this policy. Data compromise expenses, and this is where there has been a breach of personally identifying information that you hold, and you need to incur expenses as a result. So the cost, for example, to provide notification to all of the affected parties, or to hire a technical professional to figure out how there was a breach, if there was a breach, who was affected, that kind of stuff. So the expenses that you're incurring. Computer attack similarly is about the costs you incur after the event to replace or restore data or computer systems, that sort of thing. Cyber extortion. Extortion is one of the leading causes of loss in Canada, and extortion can take a lot of different forms. So that's a broad statement, but it is effectively where a third party is somehow taking control of your data and then either threatening to release it to the public or delete it or manipulate it or do other things to it unless you give them money. And the insurer will provide $10,000 worth of up to $10,000 for negotiating and investigating the situation, and in certain cases, even to arrange payment to end the extortion. Data compromise liability, related back to the first one I talked about, is when there has been a breach of this personally identifying information. We've already talked about the costs you incur. Now we're talking about coverage to protect you if somebody sues you because their personally identifying information was breached. And personally identifying information, just to be clear, is not an email address necessarily or a name. So many of you, that might be all you have in your database, but it has to be a little bit more identifying than that in terms of confidentiality. It can't be publicly available data. But these people can, if their information is breached, can turn around and sue you for letting your information out there, their information out there. And this is the portion of the policy that would protect you. Network security liability is similar, but it is claims brought by a third party alleging that your negligence caused security failure related to their systems. So not necessarily, it's more like an allegation that you allowed the propagation of malware, or like that your system allowed viruses or Trojan horses or whatever to spread, or that you were involved in a denial of service attack, or that you had a loss of third-party corporate data that you might hold, maybe a partner or funder or something like that. Electronic media liability. This one I want to flag specifically because this is the part of the policy that responds to claims brought against you, a liability claim, a lawsuit related to your online content. So your the electronic media, meaning the thing on your website, content of your website, content of your social media pages, allegations that, you know, the content you've placed up there is libelous, is defamatory of another party, has violated somebody's right to privacy or trademark. And we're seeing a lot more of this being an issue where somebody innocently posts a photo of something that they didn't have permission to post, and now the photo owner is coming after you for, you know, breaching their trademark, things like that. And so important to keep in mind, both from the coverage point of view, but also, you know, how are you managing your online content? Who is vetting the information that's allowed to be up there? Identity recovery is about paying the cost to recover identity, but this is written for businesses, just to be clear. It's about just specific to your chief executive, not necessarily super relevant for most nonprofits, but it is there. And then this is the most interesting addition to this reissue of cyber insurance that they've just released. It's called misdirected payment fraud. Up to $10,000 to pay fraudulently obtained funds in a wrongful transfer event. And the short version of that is a third party maliciously tricks you, basically, or tricks your insured or an insured into intentionally transferring them funds in a fraudulent manner. So this is like your treasurer gets an email from somebody that looks like they're your normal supplier of benthic testing equipment. And they say, instead of paying this address over here, you're going to pay this address over here now, and please send the check right away because we're overdue. And your treasurer does a good job and sends the check to the new person. That's not crime because they did it intentionally. They sent it willingly. It is now misdirected payment fraud, and the policy provides up to $1,000 for that. It's a little bit more. There's obviously more nuance and complexity to that, but that's important coverage that is not typically available without additional underwriting and premium consideration. So I know that was a lot on cyber insurance, but at the same time, a very high level kind of 30,000-foot view. Really quickly, because it's not something the insurer just re-released all of this coverage package and added coverage H. They also redid their pricing models and coverage packages. If you're interested in talking about this more, send me an email. I have sort of a summary of this on one page that you can kind of look at. But just to give you an idea, these are the limits of insurance and pricing available for these packages. I will flag again, 25,000, 50,000. These are not limits sufficient to cover every contingency. You could easily exhaust them. They are available without applications, which is great because a lot of applications are lengthy and have requirements for minimum security requirements that you have in place, like multi-factor authentication on all your emails, daily backups, tested backups, all this stuff, which is good to have, and you may have them. But a true cyber policy standalone can be more expensive than this, obviously, and have a much more involved application package, which I would be delighted to review with you individually if that's something that is interesting to you. But I wanted to flag this cyber coverage here as an easy, low-cost way of sort of entering the space. And this is something we can add at any time to your existing insurance and also remove at any time if you later decide to move to a bigger package with a different provider. So real easy to handle. We can talk about it individually, but I just wanted to have that moment to sort of talk about this because it's something that the insurer just sort of refreshed recently. We're really delighted to have 116 participating organizations. I wanted to give you a little bit of an overview that, you know, of those participating in our insurance program, membership can range anywhere between 10 and over 1,800. 70%, just under 69, I think, were incorporated organizations. We're able to accommodate both incorporated and unincorporated organizations. And a growing number of organizations are becoming involved in some form of land protection, whether it's owning land through donation or purchase, conservation easement agreements, management. It's a growing area where more and more organizations are getting involved in that space. It's something we can accommodate. Some of the standard exclusions in the general liability wording, many of these will not apply to you. Racing with powered watercraft, whitewater rafting. There's a nuanced exclusion here. This is summaries. Basically, whitewater paddling activities are excluded unless they are class 1 on the international river scale. So, you know, a normal paddle on a gentle river is not a problem. It's when you get into the class 2 or higher that requires special insurance. Water skiing, wakeboarding, parasailing, I don't think anybody's involved in that. Hunting and firearms is the authorization of the use of firearms or of hunting on, you know, an example might be that your organization coordinates an event that is related to firearms or hunting, or engages actively in permission. Again, if you own a piece of land, for example, and you know, you engage in granting permission to people to hunt, recognizing fully that there are circumstances in which hunting is sometimes required, either as part of a managed forest plan or as part of just a MNRF requirements for the space. That is an exclusion we can adjust in cases where that is a necessary requirement. But it's just a basic exclusion on all the policies for the start. The map extension. So the liability insurances we've been talking about include an exclusion for professional services, meaning a long list of things that are professional services provided to others. For example, lawyers, doctors, accountants, insurance brokers. Professional services are covered under an entirely different type of insurance called errors and omissions or professional liability insurance. So it's excluded under the general liability insurance. That exclusion, the normal language includes an exclusion for the preparation or approval of maps. We have a special endorsement that reads that coverage back in, as long as the maps the base map is designed by a professional. So you grab a map off of like a ministry website or a GIS or something, that you then add your own markings to, and that it's not used specifically for navigating the wild wilderness or waterways. It's not for necessarily specifically guiding you somewhere. A lot of the maps are like, you know, here's our region and here are a couple of interesting points, that sort of thing. And that you're not providing those maps as a professional service, meaning that's not what you do for a living. Then there's a coverage read back in for that map, meaning it's not excluded anymore. And then watercraft over 10 meters in length are used to carry people or passengers for a charge, people or cargo for a charge, I should say, is absolutely excluded. At that stage, we start getting into marine underwriting, and that's a whole other thing we can speak to later. I wanted to talk about best practices very briefly, and I'm going to make sure we do allow some time for question and answer, and I'm rambling a little, but this is my main disclaimer that I am not a lawyer. And so when we start talking about best practices, what I'm really talking about is risk management a lot of the time. And I do get a lot of calls and a lot of questions around what that looks like and how do we do this, how do we do that. In a lot of cases, what we're going to talk about is generalities that are maybe around how we consider risk management tools. But in certain cases, it might be necessary for you to have a conversation with a lawyer or a legal professional just to get some formal guidance in that space. Many of you won't necessarily be involved in alcohol at an event, but there are certainly situations, maybe you have a volunteer appreciation event or some other kind of community activity, AGMs, whatever, where there's going to be alcohol available for sale or service. As the host, you owe a duty of care to the attendees at an event. And this is true whether it's dry or whether there is alcohol present. If you are serving or making alcohol available, you may be responsible for the result of that consumption of that and of that alcohol. We call that host liquor liability. Sort of the easiest way to get out of trouble and be clear of this is to transfer the risk by hiring a third party to do the alcohol sales service. So that can mean a lot of different things. It could be that you host your event at a venue that has staff and a liquor license. They are serving the alcohol, so you don't really have anything to do with it. That would be great. Or you hire a venue that doesn't have those things, but then you hire a local restaurant, bar, whatever to come in and they do all the alcohol sale and service. Again, not you. BYOB events, if that's on the table, are also a lower risk because they don't absolve you of all guilt because it's still your event, but really you had no control over somebody bringing and consuming their own alcohol, so it's a much lower risk by comparison to the alternative. If you will be serving, meaning that you, the organization or the association, will be through your volunteers or employees serving alcohol, make sure that you're reviewing all of the requirements with AGCO, Alcohol and Gaming Commission of Ontario. And if you need to, again, depending on the circumstances, you might need an SOP or a special occasions permit. All of the servers should have their Smart Serve training, and that's something that you should make sure that they have before you pick them. Offer food and water. That's really just risk management 101 for this sort of thing. Like, you can't just have alcohol, you have to have some food and some water available for people. And close the bar an hour. It says here an hour before the event ends. It can, whatever is relevant to your organization, but just taking into consideration how we can minimize the exposure to people. Close the bar a little bit before the thing's over. Make sure that anybody who's super intoxicated is to the best of your ability not permitted to drive home. Nobody's expecting you to, chain somebody to a wall or anything like that, but just to the best of your ability. Have volunteers assigned with clear responsibilities when it comes to these events, who's just going to keep an eye on things, whether it's intoxication or making sure that there's sufficient, food and water, and that you've got an idea of like an event, like you've got some kind of concept of what are we going to do if somebody presents as being way too intoxicated at an event, whose job is it to intervene, so that you're not lost in the moment. As a rule, if you're going to be hosting an event with over 100 participants, or if it's an event focused on alcohol, like a wine tasting or something like a brewery or whatever, give us a call. You can call me for less. That's not an issue. Typically, there's no premium implications for a smaller gathering than that. But just give us a shout and we can talk through it in more detail. We get a lot of questions about waivers. Unless we have spoken or had correspondence about a specific event where we've decided that a waiver is required based on the underwriter's requirements, waivers are not carte blanche required by this insurance program, but they are still a very important and useful tool. And I know a lot of you implement them regardless. Waivers are legal documents, so it's not something that I can necessarily provide direct recommendations on, and they should be used using a qualified legal professional. A lot of the time, I sort of have seen people using a template or an example they found online to sort of, you find one you like that fits your situation, and then you tweak it to make yours, so that when you go to your legal professional, they're not starting from scratch, and it saves you some money, it saves you some time. Waivers and other corporate documents, things that are important, should be held for up to 7 years. That's a very long time, I recognize. Certainly when it comes to waivers, 2 years minimum would be absolutely true. And that's because for most claims, at least not all, the regular statute of limitations on how long somebody has to sue you is about 2 years. So having a waiver on hand for at least that long is important. We also recommend you create an incident reporting form to complement the waiver. So if there is an incident that you experience, you have a form, you know what to do, right? You fill out the thing. It's not left up to questioning at the time. Again, you can find these online. The Insurance Bureau of Canada has a sample on their website for incident reporting forms. You can find other ones online that you like and tweak them to your needs. Making waivers stick is hard. Even if you have a liability waiver that says, by signing this document, I swear that I will not sue you if I get hurt at your event, they're probably still going to sue you and try to beat the waiver. That's the first thing the plaintiff's counsel is going to do. And they might succeed, they might not. That's the fight that will happen in court. To give you the best shot of having the waiver stick, we want to use clear language in identifying the potential risks and resulting injuries from your activities. We want to make sure that you're trying to be as clean as possible for these things. And I know it's easy to get lost in the weeds of legal jargon, but basically you're trying to make sure that the participant understands the exposure that they have, the risks, accepts the risks, and knows that they are waiving their right to bring legal action against you. And you can influence that by adding bold text, colored text, highlighted text, and other ways of making it really obvious. The other thing that helps is to send it in advance. And that, I know that's not That's logistically complicated, especially for events where maybe you don't know who is or isn't coming. Um, and I'm not necessarily saying getting it signed in advance, but it is a much easier defense for your insurer if the waiver was sent to everybody who might come saying, hey, take a look at this. When you show up in a week, you're going to be asked to sign it. So make sure that you take the time to review it and read it and ask us any questions that you have beforehand. As opposed to they show up at the event and you get handed a piece of paper and they're like, sign this, but we got to go. You got 2 minutes, like we got to get out of here. Very easy for their lawyer to say, you didn't give me sufficient time to review this legal document that was binding and contractual and whatever. So whatever you can do to give them the ability to review it before time, even if they sign it at the event, having sufficient time to review is really important. When it comes to trails, natural property, I'll talk about this briefly because not everybody's involved in this space, but again, I'm not a lawyer, but the prevailing legal component that will apply here is the Occupier's Liability Act. And under the Occupier's Liability Act, it speaks to the fact that you as the occupier, meaning the person in control of the space, whether you're the owner, a tenant, some other kind of organization managing an area, you owe a duty of care to the people entering that space. Meaning they have a certain, well, depending on the duty of care, they have a certain expectation of safety. Now, where it is a naturalized piece of property, vacant land or a forest or whatever, or a recreational trail marked reasonably as such, the duty of care goes from up here to down here. And effectively the responsibilities you have, again, this is a legal act and I please read it and review it. But what the act would imply is that the duty you owe is slightly lower to say that, where you might owe me a duty of care if you invite me in for a cup of coffee, I have every right to expect safety in your living room. On a natural trail, a recreational trail I'm using, I could expect that any known hazards would be addressed and not called to attention, and not that there's not any active traps for my injury there, but I have a lower expectation of care because it is a natural piece of property. Keeping all of that in mind, when a lawsuit arrives, it is much easier for your insurer to defend you if there are strategies in place to help them. So if you have a log of some kind or a record, whatever it might be, of, Joe walked the trail on such and such a day, no issues. Or we repaired this, fence on this day, and whatever. Using trail signage, marking off known hazards. And I'm not talking about every rock in the road or whatever necessarily, but clear hazards. If there's something where there's a known risk to people, a known issue, sudden drop off, sharp, a sharp edge with no fencing, like that's where you need to think about how we minimize our risk. Charging for access, meaning asking people for money, should be, specifically to using these natural pieces of property, should be avoided, because if you ask them for money, suddenly that duty of care goes straight back up. If you are in charge of collecting money for like ancillary features like a parking lot, you're charging $5 to park, but they can walk the trail for free, that does not apply there. So just something to keep in mind. And then just ensure that I mentioned it before, an incident reporting form, these sorts of things, that anything you can think of ahead of time to make it easier for your volunteers in the moment to respond, because it's stressful when something's happening, when somebody's hurt or people are upset. Giving them a playbook ahead of time is really, really helpful. And thinking ahead of time about what the event might need in terms of like policies, procedure, whose job is what, how do we respond in an emergency, getting rid of any doubt, and replacing it with sort of like a playbook really, really helps in the time of a claim. And then keep records. I know it's not always fun. And in fact, I was the treasurer of my own little nonprofit for a little while. No, not treasurer, secretary, sorry. Treasurer would have been even worse, but I was a bad minute taker, real bad minute taker. And I got out of that job because it's really important being able to look back on your institution's records. If you are incorporated, you obviously have certain obligations as to what your record keeping looks like. But even for small unincorporated organizations, having record of your important decisions and events, things like that, can really help you at the time of a claim to respond, help insure. And with that, I think I came in right sort of at the target mark, but apologies if I ran a little long. But if there are any questions, I would be happy to speak to them.
Great. Thank you so much, Ross. That was a very helpful overview. I'm sure people on the call thought so as well. Um, so we can just start on the questions that are in the Q&A. And again, a reminder, anybody, if you have questions for Ross, pop them in the Q&A now, and I will ask them of him. So the first question is, does the directors and officers coverage include students, volunteers at events, and related activities?
Um, yes. So both, uh, yes, but let me tweak the answer. So both the general liability and directors and officers liability coverage ensure the organization and your volunteer workers. Whether or not those volunteer workers are students, retirees, employed in another job, is sort of immaterial. They are your volunteer workers, so they are insured uh, as they're doing the work on your behalf. I think one of the things where the language gets a little confused, sometimes people ask like, what about the people at events? Are they covered? Um, if there is an injury to a participant in your event, so somebody's coming to your event and they are injured and they sue you, it does not matter if that person was a volunteer, if that person, sorry, it doesn't matter if the injured party was a student or a retiree or whatever. Once they're suing you and they become the third party that we are defending against. If you are regularly involved in hosting events with young people, it's worth thinking about what your risk management strategies are there, right? Like if they're attending with a school, that's very different because they're coming in with, teachers or parents or whatever. If they're attending independently of school, or, what steps are you taking? Like, are your volunteers, are you checking to make sure that your volunteers are passing any kind of vulnerable sector checks? Do you have like a minimum ratio of how many volunteers have to be together at a time with people? So I just want to be clear, like, yes is the answer to the question. Liability insurance does include, your students as volunteers while they're at your events. But if the question is like, what if there's a student who's injured at an event? The answer is still yes, but we are defending against their litigation at that stage.
Okay, thanks, Ross. Next question. So this person says they often carpool on outings. Can you speak about driver's liability and the club's liability? Does it
Yes.
change if the passengers reimburse the driver?
Yeah, there's two parts to this. First of all, I would encourage your organization to be uninvolved in coordinating carpools. There's absolutely nothing wrong with people carpooling to stuff. That's obviously people do that. That's great. Um, I would encourage you not, as an organization, I would encourage you not to be involved in the administration of that piece, because if you dip a toe into that space and say, well, why don't you go with that person? And you didn't check to make sure that that person has, a clean driving record and, appropriate insurance and whatever. If you didn't take risk management steps to make sure the person you told that person to drive with, you could expose yourself to potential liability claims related to an injury sustained. I'm not saying that carpooling is a bad idea. I'm just saying don't formalize a carpool structure, I guess is what I would say, is don't have the organization like formally picking who goes where and what. Individually, as the driver, so in Ontario, auto insurance is called an owner's policy. So the owner of the vehicle, that policy is the one that will respond to protect the owner and the driver if there is a injury sustained in the vehicle, or while using the vehicle. Like my formal answer here is to call your own insurance provider to speak with them and talk to them about any nuances that might apply to your use of your vehicle. It's something you should share with your insurance provider. I should say that the like carpooling on an infrequent basis to a volunteer activity is likely not going to be an issue for them, but it's something to check. Reimbursing the driver for the cost of gas is not typically an issue. Paying them more than the cost of gas is probably an issue, because then they're making money. It's a whole other thing. So individually, my advice is to speak to your own auto insurance providers. Everybody's got their own underwriting guidelines. So that would be kind of my formal answer. I don't expect it to be a major issue, but worth asking.
Thank you. Next, under what type of insurance does a case of libel, such as the damage to a person's reputation, fall?
Great question. Typically, again, it the depends on the specific nature of the claim and whatever. Uh, in the Ontario Nature Insurance Program, most of the time you would find coverage under the general liability insurance through something called personal and advertising injury, which responds to claims including libel or slander or defamation of character, that sort of thing. It's part of the general liability insurance. There are some directors and officers insurance policies out in the world that would do it too, but this is primarily where you find the coverage. The exception there being for online electronic media content, so Facebook and website pages, that's where that electronic media liability piece needs to be in place because the general liability doesn't typically respond to online content like that.
Thank you. Next, are pictures posted on Facebook the group's responsibility?
Short answer, yes. If it's a page you manage and have control over, then it's your responsibility to make sure that the content is you're responsible for your own page, basically. A little different if like a member, a member posts a picture on your page that they didn't have rights to, and you allowed it, you could conceivably, I guess, yeah, you could conceivably get dragged into something from the picture owner. More risk, obviously, on the individual who did the posting, but you allowed the post to be up there. So I can't say that you couldn't get named in a claim. You could get sued. You can get sued for anything, just to be super clear. Like it doesn't have to make sense or work for a liability claim to be brought against you. But I think generically, I would say that you are responsible for the content of your website or of your Facebook page, including the content of guest posters. How that would shake out in a legal proceeding, I can't say I know for sure. It would probably depend a lot on the individual circumstances.
Okay, thank you. If we have more members, does our insurance increase? And does the insurance cover all ages of members at a meeting or outing?
Great question. Yes. The number of members you have is one of the underwriting factors that influences price. It's not the only thing. So like, it's not always the direct influence. And small variations are not an issue. It's more handled on kind of a large scale. So if you had 50 and now you have 250, yes, the membership is one of the ways the insurer, the underwriters help to calculate sort of the scope of your operations and what the risk pool is. Because if you have 12 members, obviously the likelihood of potential claims is lower than if you have 1,200. So that does have an influence on it. It's not the only factor. You could be a 12-member organization doing a ton of really high risk things that are scary and have a higher premium than a group of 1,200 that's doing nothing. So it's one of the considerations. Does the insurance cover all ages of yes, the general liability insurance does not have age limitations on it for volunteer workers. The accident compensation coverage that we mentioned does have an age limitation of 75 is the cap. And that's this product that we have where I gave you the 350 per volunteer. It's a box like this that is we were able to negotiate because it doesn't ask a lot of questions. It's like how many volunteers? Okay, here's your price. There are opportunities out there in the world to remove that age limit, but now we're looking at an individual policy for your specific organization instead of being part of this group thing. And like the minimum premiums there start like at $1,000. So it typically is not something the organizations choose to take on. But liability insurance, there's no limit on the age of your volunteers.
Great, thanks. So the next question is, do you insure companies that are working with animals, such as a company that first features birds of prey encounters? And I'll first just maybe partly answer that question that Ross is talking about, the Nature Network group insurance program, which is only available to members of the Nature Network. So I'm sure Ross works with many other groups as well, but the specifics that he's talking about is for Nature Network members. So you do have to be a member, but if one of our member groups was working with animals such as birds of prey, would that be something that you could cover?
I think the answer will depend on what the work is. So encounters, for example, so if a nature network member was having an event where they had invited a group to come in, like a third party organization, company, whatever, that runs birds of prey encounters or like wildlife shows, that sort of thing. If they invited them to come to the show and perform or run their event or do their encounter, yes, the expectation would be that our insured would request that third party organization coming in would have liability insurance and show what's called a certificate of insurance, which is like proof of having insurance that lists our nature network member as an additional insured, basically saying if you get sued because of the work I do, my birds of prey encounter, my policy will protect you. As far as I would say that if the nature network member was their primary business was, going around the province and running birds of prey encounters, not typically going to fall within the Ontario Nature Insurance Program scope. That's a very different beast, not to put a pun in there by accident.
Thanks, Ross. So we're getting close to 8 o'clock, but we have time for maybe 3 or 4 more questions. I did just put my email in the chat as well. So if all of our questions don't get answered by Ross here live today, what I'll ask is that you can email me the questions and then I can compile them all for Ross so he doesn't get 100 emails. He can, also take emails, but maybe it'll be just take it easy on him and send them all to me. I compile them, and then he can send the answers in writing that I can share with everybody as well. So it'll be a good way to share your different questions. Okay, but a few more questions first. Is having a code of conduct advisable in the area of risk management?
Yeah, I would never say no to that. It's a great idea. It's not like a requirement of the underwriters necessarily, but yeah, anything you can have in place to formalize sort of what your expectations are of people, and it also gives you an opportunity to say if somebody isn't performing within their code of conduct, you can point to it and say, hey, like this is what we expect of you, and we're not doing that. So it gives you ground to stand on as well. But it's not necessarily a specific requirement of the insurance policy.
Thank you. And a secondary question to that one. This group does not have participants physically sign a waiver. They acknowledge that they have read it. Is that adequate?
I will defer to a lawyer to answer that question properly. I would think it probably won't hold up. Unless there's some record of their acknowledgement, you know what I mean? And if they're not signing it, like if it's a web form where they've checked, yes, I acknowledge it, and then they type in their email or whatever, maybe that would have a better standing. But in all likelihood, that would get there's without their signature on something or something showing that they physically like, yes, I have read this thing and I agree to it. I don't see how a court wouldn't have an easy time throwing that one out. Again, not a lawyer. I might be wrong, but that would be my take based on what I've heard from other lawyers.
Okay, so what about a person who's running equipment such as a chainsaw? Do they need to be certified for insurance to cover them?
Great question. For this particular insurance program, the underwriters have not to date required that you ensure that all of any chainsaw operator has the certification. I would say that I would be very supportive of you having that as a risk management step anyway. Just because the underwriter doesn't make you do it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not still a really good thing to do. And in those cases where it may not be possible for somebody certified to do the thing, my question would be why, and also, is there a stage where if you're doing enough chainsawing that you need to start using people who don't have the certification? Are we hitting a stage where we might need to be thinking about looking for a contractor to do it instead? So it is not specifically a requirement, but it is certainly very useful to be able to rely upon that when a lawsuit arises.
I think I'll do 2 more questions and then we'll have to cut it off there. So the next is regarding maps prepared for an event. If a map is prepared using source data like Google Earth or Land Information Ontario, is that considered a professionally prepared map?
That would be sufficient for the wording we're talking about here. Yeah, if you take the map that was prepared by a professional third party, including Google, And then if you just like add markings on it or something like here are notable locations, or this is a region of interest because of a certain species, or then yeah, there's no issue there. I will say that the second piece was that you can't be using it for specific navigation of wilderness or wildlife, so or waterways. So if you're zooming in on a Google map and then drawing like a trail for them to follow for a hike, then that would not be part of our card back-end coverage. So just something to consider there.
Thank you. And the last question again is about waivers. So is it important for an actual signature on a waiver sheet? I think you kind of answered that. And then it needs to be kept for 2 years. So I think the answer is yes, but maybe you can just confirm.
I think so. Yeah, if I understood that correctly. Yeah, it's waivers signed at the hike. If there's any way to get it to them in advance, that's a much better situation, because having them sign it as soon as they show up and be like, quick sign, we gotta go, is going to be hard to defend. But yeah, that's, I think if I understand correctly, if you can keep it for 2 years, that's best. Scan it, throw it in a folder, like, you know, whatever. It doesn't have to be top of mind, just that you can get at it if something happens.
Okay, so I'm going to end the questions there, but definitely we can work on answering the questions that we didn't get to, or any that arise. So I'm just going to recommend again that you email me, so leslieR@ontarionature.org. After this, I'll compile questions and send those to Ross. And then when we send the recording later, or maybe a little bit after that, depending how long it takes Ross to get all the answers to your questions, we'll send that out to everybody. If you have questions that are very specific to your organization about something, you know, that might not be shared by everybody, then I think it's okay to email Ross about that. But just for sort of more general questions, let's compile them and get them to him in one sheet. So thank you again very much, Ross, for joining us and for all the care that you give us. I know I'm also bombarding you with questions all the time, so I appreciate how responsive you are, and I'm sure all the groups that you work with do as well. And thank you, everybody, for joining us here tonight. Again, the recording will be shared, and the opportunity for questions will come again later. So have a good night, everyone, and take care.